Hello, everybody. Happy New Year. Adam Prine here, the Collective Social Network, and we have a great show for the first of the year. We have Victor Tiffany on. I'm going to get a couple things ready here. Make sure to check out our new TCSN groups. We have New Hampshire and California. Organizing for Birdie, January 12th, house parties nationwide. We're throwing one in Asheville for all the Oregon people down here in the valley, Southern Oregon. And so while we're waiting for Victor, we're going to start at 4. I'll tell you a little bit about the Collective Social Network. We are an organization that was formed right after Trump became president, and our mission is to change this whole political system around, completely overhaul. We got Liz Elliott, James Langford on the team, and the three of us have been brainstorming a lot of ideas how to pave way through the established Democrats into the Democratic Party, Dem exit, Dem enter, while Dem exiting simultaneously. Strongly believe both of these are important. If you guys are fighting, if you're a Democrat or a non-Democrat, if you're on the left, if you're progressive, if you're fighting amongst each other, that's not exactly what we need right now. What we need is for everyone to move forward. And the truth is, Bernie's going to run as a Democrat, and he's going to be the people we're all going to get behind. So you can go ahead and pick whoever else you want to try to push for a little while. But as soon as you realize, as soon as the movement starts really growing, and you're like, holy shit, this is bigger than I have expected, which is done, then get on board with us. Let's take Trump down, and let's get into the Democratic. Look, we're Dem exiting at the same time. We're building third parties. We're going to push our ranked choice voting, and we're going to change it so when ranked choice voting and these new laws get in, then we're going to have third parties ready to rock and roll. It'll be like they'll be so surprised. So keep building up the third parties, MMP, independent. We're all for it. We're with you guys. But at the same time, right now, we're doing which makes most sense, and we're getting some progressives into the Democratic Party. So we're going to move along here and talk to Victor Tiffany.
Howdy, howdy.
How we doing, sir?
Good. You can hear me all right then?
Yes.
Awesome.
So, you got a new book?
I do. It's a little old now, almost a year old. It's been out, but it is new on the, by multi-year standards. It's it looks like a memoir, right? What we did in 2015, 2016, but it's primarily a user's guide for citizens for peaceful revolution. Shall I say more about it? I could talk all day about what's in the book.
Sure, let's hear about it.
Yeah, well, there are some chapters that cover what we did. It's a memoir in part. We recommend most readers skip that unless you're an activist. We didn't cleanse this. We didn't whitewash what we did. We made mistakes. We covered it. We were pioneers in 2015. No one had ever built a leverage movement before, telling the Democrats, here's the candidate we're going to support. You get behind this candidate. You nominate this candidate, or you're going to lose in November. That hadn't been done before.
And the CFAR is what you're talking about?
No, that was Bernie or bust. The CFAR was midterm strategy. So that was
I worked with that.
That was a acronym for Contract for American Renewal. That was not successful. We had 70 some candidates sign that contract, and only one got elected. He was the incumbent. Ro Khanna was a CFAR candidate. And
that's right. All right.
None of the rest, none of the challengers got elected. So we're pretty disappointed with that strategy. It was what we do in the 2022 midterms. We haven't even begun to think about at this point. But right now we're focused on what we just did. Yesterday we launched a new strategy. Instead of focusing on a candidate, right? Something's happened. We were going to do something like Bernie or bust again for 2020. Maybe it would be Bernie. Maybe it would be another progressive, Tulsi or trash, the Democratic Party, something like that. But instead, the IPCC report back in October essentially scared the hell out of us. And we realized we've got to do something about climate change or we're doomed. We're essentially doomed. We don't have much time left. We've reached a stage where it's beyond a crisis. We're in an emergency. And so instead of candidate or bust, like we did in 2015-16, we're doing issue or bust.
Oh,
and we're
liking that.
We're calling it climate or bust.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's pretty much where we're at right now.
Yeah, it's a line in the sand. If Democratic Party nominee doesn't show commitment, and we have two things we're asking them to do. 2 out of 4 things we're asking them to do. They either sign a pledge to voters that they will support a comprehensive climate strategy, which I can explain in a moment, or they can sign a contract with voters, either one, whichever they prefer, and they have to either make a major speech outlining climate preservation strategy that's on our website, or include the strategy that we're outlining in their stump speech. So of those 4 things that they need to do, they need to do 2 out of those 4 things. And then they'll become a climate preservation candidate. So if we end up with, a Democrat who's a climate preservation candidate, we'll put him or her on our website, picture, party affiliation, and the number of the 4 prongs to our strategy. It's 4-pronged strategy. I'll go over in a second.
Okay.
So if a candidate signs on to 3 of those prongs, we'll list the candidate's name, the candidate's party, and list them as or her as 3 out of 4. And let's say a Green Party candidate also fulfills the commitment. Then we'll list him or her as a by name, party affiliation, and the number of the prongs to our strategy. So let me just outline the 4-prong strategy. None of these are priority over any other, right? They're all high priority because we're in an emergency. We should have been doing this 25 years ago. We wouldn't need some of these things that we now have to do, but we didn't do anything 25 years ago. There hasn't been nearly enough of an energy transformation that took place. I was hoping that's what Senator Barack Obama was referring to when he talked about a fundamental transformation. But he wasn't. He was actually talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have fundamentally transformed the United States into a corporate order. Who knew? So we're basically demanding that anybody who's going to win a contest against Donald Trump or Mike Pence, whoever it is, in 2020 is going to have to commit to a number of these 4 prongs. First, a 5% reduction in fossil fuel use per year for 20 years. That'll get us down to near zero. Second prong is the idea of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. We just have over or nearly 400 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, and that's way too high. We've got to start pulling it out. So there's electrical and electronic technology can be used. Paul Beckwith is a climatologist that consulting with us. He talks about these huge platforms, wooden platforms that can be built out in the ocean and just basically grow seaweed, right, to absorb this carbon, right? That's another technique. It's not real high tech, but it could be done, and these kind of things need to be done. So that's another one, is carbon capture. The third one is feasibility studies only. We're not pushing any one of these solar radiation management techniques, but we're convinced, because methane is bubbling up out of the Pacific Ocean, it's bubbling up out of the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, a lot of it, and more every year, because the warmer it gets, the more methane acetate thaws and boils away. And that's a positive feedback loop. Now, the only way to stop that, there's no capturing that methane. It's just all over the ocean, coming up out of the ocean. There's no capturing this. There's no real good solution to this other than some form of what's called solar radiation management, which is a part of what's called geoengineering. So we're not talking about spraying the upper atmosphere, but we want to study spraying the upper atmosphere. We want feasibility studies of atmospheric spraying. We want feasibility studies of solar satellites, not geosatellites in sync with the Earth, solar satellites, real high-tech stuff that sit between the Earth and the sun, right? Basically, we want to set up an array of umbrellas, solar umbrellas in space, and shade. This way we can target our shading instead of the upper atmosphere where the wind blows around. You got the whole Earth that might be cooled off, and sun blocking agricultural areas, which isn't going to be good for agriculture. Space-based satellite systems, which are kind of futuristic, but we're going to need these things someday anyways. Over the next couple 100 million years, the Earth is going to be warming up because the sun is gradually getting warmer. So these are things. This is something that might be handy after we resolve climate change, if we resolve climate change. But that would allow scientists and technologists to target the blocking of the sun to the Arctic and the Antarctic, right? Those are the poles you want to keep frozen. That we don't want them to thaw. That's where the methane's coming from. That's where the ice is melting from. So we want to keep
probably bacteria that's buried deep in there. We don't know what's going to come out of there.
So that's the third prong. And again, I want to stress, we're only asking a candidate to sign on to feasibility studies. If these aren't feasible, then we'll look at another solar radiation management. But we should study at least solar radiation management. And the fourth prong is the United States makes up about 14% of the world's carbon use, fossil fuel use and carbon spewing into the atmosphere. So we need a global solution. A lot of people are promoting the idea of sharing technology, not outsourcing, but sharing technologies, giving it away. That's a little bit more radical than what we're calling for. We want Congress to fund an international multilingual website so that we can share ideas, and other people in other countries in other languages can share their ideas with us, ideas on how to save energy. Right? How to conserve energy, ideas on how best to convert from fossil fuels to sustainable, best practices for that conversion, best practices for solar radiation management, best practices for carbon capture. All this is information. We want it out there. We want it free. We want it available for people all across the world to get their hands on this, be able to read it in their own language. So most language translation programs, you can click on a Russian website and just hit translate. And just like that, it comes up in English. So most of these languages have already been, language conversion softwares have already been written. There will need to be some others for languages that haven't been, because everybody who wants to use this thing, regardless of what language they speak, should be able to access it. And that's our fourth prong. Okay. And it's probably in some ways the cheapest and easiest to wrap your head around, right? It has to be a global solution. And in some ways, it's also the most important, because we're talking about sharing instead of competing, right? We're in a world crisis, and we need to mobilize on the scale of World War II. That was a huge mobilization. It was amazing what we accomplished in a very short period of time. And we need to do something on that scale again, but it's not a war this time. So instead of competition and fighting, we're actually encouraging sharing and cooperation. So it might be radical. It is radical. It might be a step, one small step toward post-capitalistic thinking, post-capitalistic sharing, right? Not necessarily a socialist world economy, but something that's post-capitalist, that's based on sharing and survival rather than competition and death, which is the direction of our current world economic order.
Yes.
So none of this, unfortunately, is laid out in here. What we have in here is the idea of leverage. So what we're asking people to do, the same thing we did with Bernie or Bust. We're asking people to go to our website, which is climateorbust.us, as in United States, and take the pledge. Okay. Take a voter pledge.
I'll put a link down below.
Yep. Just as we ask people to take a Bernie or Bust pledge to only vote for Bernie Sanders or the Green Party candidate, this time we're going to ask people to take the climate or bust pledge, because without hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million or 2 people taking this kind of pledge, there's no leverage. There's no reason the Democratic nominee has to sign on to this if we don't have just thousands and hundreds of thousands of voters saying, I'm not backing you unless you get on board with climate preservation.
Yes.
It's the only way to do it.
I'm loving it. This is great.
Previously, people would use a third party to do such a thing. But one thing we learned when Jill Stein got a whopping 1% of the vote in 2016, with 2 of the least popular and least trusted candidates in American history, she still only got 1% of the vote. Sad fact is, most Americans are still locked inside that mental 2-party prison. They're not going to break out of that. So what a union of pledged voters does is it sort of functions as a third party without being a party. So it's kind of a step away from the 2-party mental prison without actually breaking out of the 2-party mental prison.
Oh, that's the same thing we're at. I'm loving that. Like the Collective Social Network is trying to dem exit and dem enter at the same time.
Leverage is both. You dem enter as needed, and if you don't get your way, sorry, you guys, I'm going home. I'm getting out of this party. So very few people grasp that. You know, most people are partisans. They're blue or they're green. You know, they're not going to put up with the blue anymore, and they don't get it. We use the party for our purposes rather than the party elites using us for their purposes. We flip that power relationship around.
We do have the power.
Yeah, that's the idea behind leverage. You build enough people who are on board with a specific strategy, and basically at that point, you dictate your terms to the Democratic Party nominee. And if they reject you, they lose in November. And in our view, people think, oh my God, you're going to allow Trump get reelected. Look, if the Democratic Party nominee doesn't embrace climate preservation, what's the point? How are
Yeah,
they
it
any different than Donald Trump?
We're all dead.
We're all dead. Blue or red, we're all dead. Unless the Democratic Party nominee embraces climate preservation strategies.
Right now. We're on board. This is wonderful.
Great.
So I'm going to put a link in the bottom.
Okay.
And also, we're going to be working with candidates for the next 2 years.
Okay.
And if we'll do that, we're going to probably pledge. I'm going to talk to the rest of our members, but we're going to probably take the pledge, and we're probably going to work with candidates that are going to be on board with you.
Great. So we're waiting on these candidates until they formally announce. So we're holding back on Elizabeth Warren at this point. We have 2 websites. I gave you the pledge website. That's climateorbust.us. We don't have a real neat URL at this point for the candidates website. So we're still using the primary domain name, which is Citizens Against Plutocracy. That's our focus, right? Is campaign finance reform and legalization of democratic order. That's what we're about. Another way of putting it is, we weren't political revolutionaries because of Bernie Sanders. We were Bernie or bust because we were political revolutionaries. And we're still political revolutionaries, but we're setting our agenda aside for 2020 because climate change is going to kill us all. It's just our agenda isn't the most important thing going. We recognize that. We're setting it aside. We're going to focus on this existential crisis the entire human race is in. And unfortunately, there's a very small percentage of people who truly grasp this emergency. So that's part of what we have to do is get people to understand it's now or never. I mean, we're not going to have a whole lot of chances going forward. The IPCC report gave us 12 years, not 12 years to wait, but 12 years to get this thing turned around. That's why we're calling on 5% reductions per year. But that has to be, that has to be worldwide. There's no delaying this, and there's no competing over, we're going to get the solar energy market. We've got to share this stuff, and we've got to get the word out there. And really, we need a whole new world order based on cooperation and sharing rather than competition and war and so forth. So really, this crisis represents an opportunity, but we have to embrace this opportunity. And right now, the neoliberal elites, whether it's Schumer or what's his name in New Jersey, Senator Booker, any of these neoliberals just aren't going to embrace this, aren't going to do what's necessary for the human race to survive unless we basically tell them we're not supporting you without climate preservation, a commitment to climate preservation. That's it.
All right. This is great.
So we will have a new book coming out. If people want to understand how leverage works, of course, they can get their hands on Bernie or Bust. They can go to bernieorbust.info, INFO, get that. We're asking people not just read it and to understand leverage. You got it. You talked about dem enter and dem exit. That's basically, in a nutshell, the use of leverage, just in and out as needed.
Yep.
But there's so many people who don't grasp that, and that's what's primarily helpful in here. This is the only book in the world on electoral leverage. We did it. We went through it. And the nice thing about what we're doing now is we're not pioneers this time. We're not pioneers for electoral revolt. We're veterans of electoral revolt. 3.5 years ago, we put out a press release to about 30 media organizations. Yesterday, we put out a press release to 590 media organizations. 3.5 years ago, I used my personal email address to send them out. This time, we used our own domain, citizensagainstplutocracy.com. So that we have so many more advantages. We're not going to make the mistakes we made 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago. We're way ahead of the game. It's just it's a little more difficult. Part of what caught on with Bernie or Bust was Bernie the candidate, right? He was partly kind of a cult of personality. And Bernie or bust fed into that, not intentionally. It wasn't until we saw what happened after he endorsed Hillary Clinton, or certain other things that he did, campaign for her and so forth, that we started to realize by the people's response how much they were actually wedded to Bernie rather than a progressive platform and agenda.
Yes. Yeah, I saw that too.
Yep. So this time, some of the advantages of using an issue rather than a candidate, no one's going to accuse climate change of being too old, or right? Or let me see, what are some of the other complaints? It hasn't had issues of sexism or sexual harassment in its campaign, right? And think about the framing on this. We are for climate preservation, which makes all of our opponents out there supporting climate change. They support climate change. So we're in a position that we can frame all of our opponents. Obviously, this is true with Donald Trump. He supports climate change, and he's a real hypocrite about it because he wants a wall around his Scottish golf course to protect from rising oceans. He knows this stuff is happening, and he doesn't give a crap. He's just going to destroy the entire climate, Earth's climate, for the benefit of economic, growth for a little while or whatever. He's kind of a 19th century liberal in many ways, in a 21st century when we need, modern, conventional kind of thinking. Unconventional maybe is a better.
Yeah, way ahead. We need to think way outside of the box.
Yeah, we do. So this is partly what we're aiming to do here, is this outside of the box innovative strategy. We're hoping it catches on. We're hoping people take this pledge, because if we don't, we're probably doomed. We're going to have 1 or 2 more election cycles to get Congress on board, to get a president who's committed to climate preservation, or it's over. We're running out of time. We've got things that are just, we've got this. I mentioned methane as a positive feedback loop, global warming feedback loop, right? So it started with carbon. It warmed the earth a little bit. That melted a little bit of methane, which warmed the planet a little bit more, which caused more methane to melt, which caused more warming, right? So that's a cycle, vicious cycle. And that's one of several. The forest fires are another one. Those forest fires release a lot of carbon, which warms the atmosphere, which dries the forest floor, which causes nastier forest fires, which feeds more carbon. That's another positive feedback loop. All these coming from the fact that the earth is too warm, and pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere in the long run will solve this problem. But meanwhile, what do we do for the 30, 40 years between now and then? We can't let these positive feedback loops run out of control, or we're just as doomed as if we do nothing. So that's why the 4-pronged strategy we consider to be both comprehensive and required, right? We've got to do something to cool this planet. And my background is high tech, so I have no problem thinking about space-based solar satellites. But there's going to be plenty of challenges. You could have geosatellites too. It would require a lot more of them. And so they'd be framed so that as they spin around the Earth, when they get near the poles, they turn into an umbrella. And when they get away from the poles, they flip back into transparent, right? So you can do it you can do it chemically by modifying the actual pane, if you use like these massive umbrella panes, or you can mechanically flip them, right? Those would be geosatellites. And that might be in the short run one way to approach this, but we really have to cool Antarctica and the Arctic for, well, really the same reason, but different problems. One's methane and one's ice melting. So there's really, ice melting is a problem on both poles of the planet. So we're really in as I said, we're in a crisis. This is an emergency, and really climate or bust is kind of the a desperate cry for help. Climate or bust is a strategy. It's a strategy. It's a slogan, and it's a cry for help. We need politicians to do something about climate change, and if they don't, I tweeted a reelected Long Island Democrat who's apparently not going to embrace the Green New Deal. I tweeted her today and said, look, if you can't get on board with the Green New Deal, you're no better than Donald Trump or anyone else in the GOP. And that's kind of hardball we have to play. We can't keep supporting these Democrats who aren't going to help us save the earth. It's just, they're no better than the GOP just because they might have better social policies, right?
Yeah. This come down to blue or red. This is not the time to worry about that.
Right.
We need to worry about policies. And of course, we need to get Trump out of there. But we can do that by installing someone that's going to change things and not do the same thing we've been doing over and over.
Our strategy may end up being Bernie or bust again. Right? If Bernie Sanders is the only one who makes this commitment, we know he's committed to fighting climate change. So if he's the only one who signs a pledge and gives a speech outlining 3 or 4 of these prongs of our strategy and no one else does it, we're right back to Bernie or bust again. This could evolve into Bernie or bust, right? So because we expect the Green Party candidate to get on board with the strategy, there's nothing particularly radical there, other than the idea of sharing information for free. That's somewhat radical, but it's also inexpensive, right? It's just a website, so it's nothing. There's no high price to it, so it's something that's feasible, and we're not asking for a feasibility study on that. They have to actually sign on to that. It's something I'm sure Bernie Sanders would understand and sign on to. Maybe Senator Warren would sign on to something like this and commit to climate preservation, but I don't know who else. I don't think a neoliberal is going to do this. And if they don't do this, Donald Trump will be reelected.
I don't want that. And what about, so they got this Green New Deal, and everybody's arguing about it. The Green Party's saying it's theirs, the Democrats stole it, now the Democrats are changing it. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, it sounds a little silly. I had a kind of a hard-nosed Green come after me when I posted the climate or bust pledge idea in a Green New Deal Facebook group. And he kind of said, you got to get on board with the Green Party. They're the only ones who are going to do this. Democrats are corporatists. They're not going to really get on board with the Green. It doesn't matter, really. This whole idea of party loyalty to me is silly. On one hand, he's probably right, and most Democrats are not going to be serious about this, but we have to get rid of them. We have to primary them. Right. We have to somehow get it through people's heads. And our tool, we're fighting against people watching television and all these deceitful ads and all this high-priced campaign electioneering communication. The cost of television ads is very, very high, and that's part of why everything's so corrupt and rigged, because of the way the Supreme Court has unleashed corporate money and plutocrats' money. So they back their candidate with all this advertising, and progressives counting on working stiffs like you and I to put out what we can out of money we spend normally paying rent and everything else that we pay, mortgage, rent, whatever we spend our money on. We have to help fund these progressive candidates. And it's very hard for them to compete against the candidates pre-selected by the oligarchs and the plutocrats. So there's a very stiff problem with a headwind, if you will, in campaign finance. But what we have, we're using it right now. We have the internet. We have this tool available to us, so that you got to figure out how best to use this. And we did it with Bernie or bust. We built a movement with virtually no money, using volunteers to get the word out. about Bernie or bust. And we've already got somebody who's reached out to us on our Facebook page, which is Revolt Against Plutocracy, by the way. And he's communicating, messaging us, and he's about ready to put out this huge blast to all these groups. So he's really kind of our first climate or bust volunteer, just out of nowhere.
Nice.
He likes it, he's embraced it, and he's going to just spend his time promoting the climate or bust voter pledge in the coming days. So one thing we did that wasn't a mistake, we thought it was a good idea, and we're going to do it again this time. In 2016, every month on the date that we launched the original Bernie or Bust website, June 22nd, on the 22nd of every month, we put out a new narrative. Something like one month it was Bernie or Bust is a declaration of war on the neoliberal establishment. And all these different strategies, all these different approaches toward getting people to sign on to the Bernie or Bust strategy. And every one of them we explained, people, this is leverage. We are forcing the Democrats, a small group of us. It doesn't take, think about how leverage works, right? You can have a weak person lift a heavy boulder. How? With leverage, using leverage, whether it's a steel pipe with a rocking on a little rock, leaning and tilting around a rock, whatever it is, it's easy, light force. In this case, maybe 100,000, 200,000 voters pushing something very, very substantial. The Democratic Party. That's how leverage works in electoral theory.
Basic physics.
Yeah, the physics of scaremongering, really, and that was part of what we came to understand with Bernie or Bust was how people were reacting to it. Even Bernie supporters in 2015, we came to realize very early that this strategy scared the shit out of people. So we realized, hey, fear is a motivator for voters. That's commonly understood. Let's use the fact that this scares people and try to make it work. And I think it would have worked in 2015 and 16, or